You know, these conspiracy theories about how COVID-19, this virus, China released it deliberately to destroy the West. And it's true, it's killed millions of us and devastated our economies. But look now, look at the protests, some of them violent, all over China against the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping and the brutal way that he's been trying to control this pandemic. So even if you believed that theory that China released the virus deliberately, and I don't, you have to admit that if it was a plot, it's backfired, and massively, because China is now facing devastation. In fact, the whole power of the communist dictatorship is threatened precisely because it did try to use this pandemic to at least prove that dictatorships are best and democracies are weak. Talk about karma. Talk about a boomerang. Now, this virus, of course, started in Wuhan, China, almost exactly 3 years ago, probably after it leaked from a government laboratory. And it was there, in Wuhan, on Sunday, 3 years on, that protesters were out in the streets defying dictator Xi, calling for an end to his brutal lockdowns, and they were fighting his police as well. Now, this takes a lot of guts. Obviously, in China, it's a police state, very authoritarian. Xi's been really cracking down. But right now, across the country, there is a wave of anti-government protests that are worse than anything China has seen since the Tiananmen Square democracy protests 33 years ago that ended in a massacre as the Communist Party sent in its army with orders to shoot to kill. Thousands were murdered. But here we are today. The dictatorship facing a whole new threat because of the virus that it unleashed accidentally and which it's been trying with most brutal means to suppress. In fact, Chinese citizens are rioting against the regime's zero COVID policy of locking down apartment blocks and factories and towns, even whole cities, as soon as there's an infection. Just one infection will do it. And after 3 years of this, what's the result? There's been a new surge of infections lately, worse than ever before in China, lockdowns everywhere. In fact, the Japanese investment bank Nomura estimates that a third of China is now in some sort of lockdown. And because of that, the economy is tanking. And many Chinese are obviously now sick of it. Who wouldn't be? At Apple's biggest factory in China, protesters have fought against police trying to keep them locked in. But now, anti-lockdown protests have spread around the country. And the trigger was this fire in Xinjiang last week in an apartment building. 10 people died. And what got people on the Chinese social media so upset was the people there had been locked down for 3 months. And it seems that fire trucks had trouble getting in because of the barriers that authorities have put up to lock people in. And on the weekend, there were protests, often by students in many, many Chinese cities. These are just the ones we know about. The censorship, of course, has been amazing. But we've seen protests in cities like Beijing, the capital, where people have been holding up blank pieces of paper to represent the censorship. Protests in Chengdu, in Nanjing, in Tsinghua, the university in Nanjing and elsewhere. It's been incredible in Chongqing, in Chengdu, in Guangzhou, in Shanghai, where students actually chanted "Down with President Xi" and called for freedom, which is almost unheard of in this totalitarian state. But here's the thing that threatens the dictator and his regime. You see, Xi is trapped. He's trapped like a communist dictator, in fact. He's trapped precisely because he's a dictator and precisely because he's used this pandemic, or tried to prove to the world that his dictatorship is the way to rule. Democracies, they're weak. He's been saying for years that his zero COVID policy is the best And democracies couldn't make these tough calls like his regime did, shutting down cities at the drop of a hat. And his people have been saying, yeah, look at America, 1 million deaths, but look at China, just 5,000, if you believe the dictatorship statistics, of course. But things have now changed. As you know, we in the West have learned to get on with life now. And Chinese soccer fans on social media have been complaining that why are they locked down when they can see other fans of the World Cup in Qatar have a ball there with no masks at all. Now here's the trap. President Xi, virtually staked his leadership on this policy, and now he can't get off. And that's not just because it would be a massive loss of face if he finally gave up zero COVID now after demanding 3 years of sacrifice, terrible sacrifice from his people. Because he's been arguing this for ages, of course, while the economy's been going down the toilet. And how can he now say I was wrong? Because, you know, dictators are supposed to know everything, right? He would also, though, have to admit the West was right all along, that life must go on. But in fact, it'd be worse than that. If this virus does take off in China and then they, you know, end the lockdowns and it gets even worse, the death toll could be enormous. She knows this. It could be enormous. And for one reason, it's because China's vaccine didn't work well. And she was too proud to use Western ones instead. It's actually got a Chinese company that's licensed to make one of the Western vaccines that do work in China, wasn't allowed. Then, of course, a lot of Chinese didn't get vaccinated, did they? They thought the dictator would save them. Only half the people over 80, the most vulnerable group, the ones most likely to die, only half have had the jab. So, if this virus does take off, if the vaccine doesn't work well, if the hospitals are overwhelmed, and if the deaths are as bad as the West were, and all this after 3 years of Xi's zero COVID, what does he tell the Chinese people then about his magnificent leadership? What does he tell the people that like to knife him in the back up the top there in Beijing? So dictator Xi is trapped. He's trapped by his own arrogance. And the Chinese people, they're going to suffer one way or the other. They're going to suffer or they'll have to revolt. And guess what? It turns out then that communism doesn't work. Who'd have guessed?